We are now ready to officially start the panel part, and it is my pleasure to announce the first debate during the 12th European Remembrance Symposium. The debate will be on the topic Freedom as a Current Challenge for Public History and Civic Education. It will be moderated by Rafał Rogulski, and the panelists are Barbara Walshe, Dialogue and Restorative Justice Facilitator and currently Expertise Support at the ENRS, Georgiy Kasianov from Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin, and Maria Luz Martínez Seijo from Congress of Deputies of Spain, Madrid.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will be switching now into English to make the discussion more or less smoothly. Barbara, please take the place. Barbara Walshe, Maria Luz Martínez, and Georgiy Kasianov. Please take a place. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now a plan to discuss more or less 1 hour and a half, and then we have a surprise for you. But about surprise, I will be speaking afterwards. And now, let us start. We have on the stage Maria Luz Martínez. She's a politician from Spain, a member of Spanish Parliament, and a reporter about education, historical education in Europe for Council of Europe. Barbara Walshe from Ireland was a chair, long years chair of Glen Creagh Center for Peace and Reconciliation, very important institution working to reconcile Irish people with British people and Irish people with Irish people. And Professor Georgiy Kasianov, an Ukrainian academic working in Lublin, specialist exactly of this kind of work which we are doing here, so of historical policy. Let us start having you representatives of different countries with very different histories. Let us start with the question to all of you. Please describe the main challenges regarding history education, history policy, remembrance policy in your countries. What are the main challenges in your countries? I suggest to start with Maria Luz Martínez.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to send my gratitude to Rafał Rogulski, because that was a very nice invitation since we met in Paris, talking about remembrance and the work that I was doing in my report. So thanks a lot for this invitation. That gives me the opportunity to talk to you about the history of my country, so that you get to know a little bit of what we are doing and how we are struggling to change history teaching and try to make it closer to a student, especially teenagers nowadays. Well, I suppose that Spain, as any other European country, has had a very long history, and the most recent history in the 20th century is very dramatic Indeed, we had a democracy in the 30s. There was a coup d'etat, followed by a civil war and a dictatorship which lasted for more than 40 years. So we recovered freedom, which is the key word of this symposium, in the 1970s. So a very long time waiting for freedom to be recovered by the Spanish society. So for us, the word freedom meant losing lives, fighting for rights, fighting for democracy, fighting for basic values that the Spanish society had achieved, and in just a coup d'etat were lost and left my country in darkness for a very long time. So since we recovered democracy, that was in 1978 when the constitution that we have nowadays was passed, we have been trying to open the different massive graves that were closed for decades in the country, and we have been trying to heal some problems that we had in our society between the two different bands that took part in the Civil War. But it hasn't been until 2022, only 2 years ago, that we finally passed the law of democratic memory, which tries to restore dignity, reparation for the victims, and is trying to delete all the different symbols that are still spread all over the country, which remind the dictatorship and some of the people responsible for murders and the different crimes that were committed through the dictatorship. So this law is very important for all the Spanish society, basically for most people in the country, because as I said before, the country was divided into different parts, the winners and the losers. And the losers couldn't recover their relatives, the families, and they didn't even know where they were. We are talking about almost 150,000 people who were disappeared between 1936 and 1943. And out of them, there were only 11,000 people who have been recovered, the names, so the dignity, and the families have been able to bury them. We know that there are still more than 2,000 massive graves which haven't been opened, and there are more than 30,000 people missing. So we haven't been even able to recover the names, the remains of the people, so the families can finally bury them with dignity, which for us is a very important word. So, as I said before, the law is trying to guarantee this coexistence between the Spanish society by reparation, by opening these graves and giving the families back the people who were buried there, by recognizing and bringing the names back to reality. And at the same time, there is a very important second part, which is trying to heal those injuries in society. And this is done with the cooperation of all the different administrations. And this means that all the fascist symbols are eliminated from public spaces. That's the part regarding what we are doing with history, with our memory. But there is another important law that we passed in 2020, and it's the education law. The education law has three important roles and objectives that we are finally implementing this year, because since the law was passed, there was a period of time to be adapted and to be fulfilled and executed at schools everywhere in the country. So this is like the last year for the whole curriculum to be implemented at the different educational levels. First of all, we are very interested in changing the way history is taught at schools. In the past, it was very academic, and history was mainly taught chronologically, so one period after another period. And there are so many contents regarding history. It's such a dense subject that it was very difficult for students to be able to associate and interpret some historical facts. So what we are doing nowadays, first of all, is trying to cover all the Spanish history through compulsory education, but we are focusing mainly on the last 2 years of secondary education and the year before going to university, where the content have been selected, and we give a priority to content regarding 20th century history, so that students understand much more, then they make it closer those events that happened in the recent past, so that they understand it better. They have a sense in their reality, in their common life, and there is much more proximity with the families, with their communities, and at the same time, it's much easy to associate those contents with the reality they have nowadays. So basically, to build by comparing historical facts with reality nowadays, that they can make their own criteria, their own judgment, and we also want to prevent, really negative historical facts from happening in the future. We also have introduced another subject, which is civic and ethical education, which is compulsory for all students in different periods of education, in primary and secondary education, and it's aimed at deepening on the values, democratic values, and citizenship values. This subject was deleted in the previous law, and we thought that it was very important, especially because we are in a European framework, and I think we need to keep on being committed with the principles defended as well by the Council of Europe, which within its recommendations, one of them is to have this citizenship education everywhere. And finally, there is a new competence introduced at schools nowadays, which is citizen competence, which is a cross-curricular subject, and therefore it has to be worked by all teachers at all different stages. So basically, this is a summary of what we have been doing in Spain in these last years to get back remembrance, to prioritize remembrance, and in a very wide sense, because we want the whole society to be involved in it, and especially starting by young generations. Thank you.
Thank you. One question according to that, how it is seen from the political point of view, if there is a common direction shared by all main political parties at the political scene in Spain, or are there differences?
Yes, there is still a reluctance. This is a very controversial topic. And as I said, we have a very young democracy. It's only been for the last 47 years. And there are still many people who haven't been able not only to heal injuries, but they don't want them to be closed. And by them, what they just want to do is that what happened in the past shouldn't be talked about in the present. So they just want to erase it completely, as if the dictatorship hadn't existed. But obviously, that's not a way to heal people's injuries and people's feelings, because there are still many. Everybody in Spain has a family relative who lost somebody in the civil war, in the dictatorship, and his body hasn't been recovered yet. So we will not be able to heal these injuries until this law is fully implemented and we recover the dignity of everybody who was on the other side. So yes, at the moment we have some problems, because as I said before, this law was passed only 2 years ago. And last year we had regional elections. And as you know, the politics are a little bit complex everywhere in Europe. And also in my country, it's decentralized. We have 17 different regions with their own governments, and there are coalitions. There are coalition government with the extreme rights, who in a way are still nostalgic of those times. So what they are trying to do is pass new laws in the regional government and trying to make people forget the national law and erasing everything that regards reparation and different resources that had to be spent by the different administrations to keep on opening these massive graves, and obviously, erasing all dictatorship symbols from public spaces. So they are bringing back some of those symbols. There is a problem, of course, because this is against the Spanish constitution and is against the national law. So now it will be in court, and hopefully we will find a common sense agreement so that the whole society in my country find this coexistence, which is more than necessary after such a long time of sorrow.
Thank you very much. We will come back, of course, to you after first round of the questions. Barbara, I would like to ask you, how do you see the main challenging issues in the history dialogue, in the dialogue about remembrance, and in the history education in Ireland?
So I suppose just to give you a picture of Ireland, a short picture of Ireland. Basically, it's an island on the edge of Europe. Its closest neighbour is Great Britain. It has a population of 7 million people, 5 million in the Republic of Ireland, and in this, which is called the South of Ireland, and in the North of Ireland you have a population of 1.7. So the whole island, basically from the census last year, has a population of 7 million people. So Ireland, despite its size, has a complex history. It was colonized, like many countries, by Great Britain for a large portion of its life. And really, freedom was the cry and the cause that Irish people really, down through the centuries, had a real strong wish for self-determination and for freedom, for the ability to rule themselves. And about 100 years ago, that happened as a result of the Easter Rising, which is part of Irish history in 1916, which basically was a blood sacrifice taken by 7 people who were executed, and really which kind of mobilized the country after that to negotiate with England at that time and to become what was called a state or a free state. So if freedom was the call in the Republic of Ireland, the call in the north of Ireland was different. So for Northern Ireland, they wished to remain and be part of Great Britain. So their identity was British, was Irish, but was British. So that led to the partition of the country. So when the country was partitioned, it also contained thousands of Irish nationalists who were more or less trapped behind the northern border. And as a result of partition, the notion behind that was that you had a Protestant state for a Protestant people because the majority were Protestant during that time. And the nationalist people that were living there really were treated unfairly, which basically led again to the outbreak of protests for civil rights in the late 60s, and it took a downward spiral into violence in the 70s, which basically lasted until the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. So when we talk about history, on the island of Ireland, you had basically two different narratives of how history was seen and how things were seen. So for the Republic of Ireland in the south, the narrative was around patriotism, around the revival of the language, around being proud of your country, being Irish for the Irish, and also, of course, it was very closely allied to the Catholic Church, which basically, lasted up until maybe the 60s and the 70s. So to add to the complications, it joined the European Union, it joined with Britain in the early 70s, and I'll talk about that in a minute and the impact of that on our history and on the conflict and on Ireland in general. So when history was taught in the Republic of Ireland, basically it was the narrative of the hero's journey. It was the fight for freedom. It was allied to the revival of the language, and the protection of the state during that time. So that was the narrative. So the narrative was the narrative, but at the same time, it really wasn't the true narrative either, because it also left out the fact that before independence, there were over 30,000 Irish men who were killed in the First World War and who were British at that time before 1916. So the families of those people at that time who came home from the First World War basically could not even talk about their experience in the war, but also they were not seen as being Irish during that time. And it took until 2006 for the Irish state to recognize the fact that those men had died during the First World War. So the thing that I would say, the experience of teaching history and the impact of history on the Republic of Ireland in those early years was one of state building, one that was quite narrow, one that ignored the fact that there was a significant Protestant population in the south of Ireland, many of whom left because it was a very cold place for Protestants to live in the south of Ireland. Then north of the border, you had a situation where you had 5 million people at the time who were divided, who lived separately, who went to church separately, who went to school separately, and in a way, even though they lived close to each other, didn't know a great deal about each other. So in some way, when the conflict broke out, the thing that actually really helped people, it wasn't really the school system, because it was quite partisan in its own way. The Protestants in state schools talked about English history. They also talked about European history. The Catholic schools, which were basically used by the Catholic community or the nationalist community, really had some Irish history, but most history was learned from people's families, from their homes, from their communities. So a lot of the history that was there, and a lot of the teaching of history from the research that has been done on it, teachers themselves felt very insecure about teaching the history because they were diverse narratives. There was also a political system at that particular time in the North that weaponized history in the interests of one-upmanship on the other community. So the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 was kind of a watershed moment because the majority of the violence stopped. History teaching didn't change much for a while, but the fact that there was peace of a kind, that there was distance, that there was space, enabled people to be able to have a bigger, a wider vision of what happened. Now, that did not happen overnight. That's still happening. It's a process. And we're still living with the legacy of that conflict. Just listening to yourself talking about the scale of what happened in Spain, and the scale was nothing like what happened in Spain. What happened in a very small part of Ireland was that 3,500 people were killed very violently, and 50,000 people were injured on a very small space of ground. And the legacy of that to this day basically is still going, is still part of that. History teaching, in a way, has developed and changed because I think of the growth of museums and the work that they do. But I would say that in the north of Ireland, one of the biggest contributors to peace was the community work that was done at local level by grassroots organizations. When people couldn't speak to each other, they brought people together to understand each other. And what people discovered was there was very little difference between any of them. They basically lived apart, but they watched mostly the same television programs and they read the same books. But they didn't know that. So the teaching of history, if you were to look at the curriculum in the north of Ireland today, they look at the contentious issues. Not all schools, but a lot of them do. And that's also done in the Republic of Ireland. And I think what's helped there is the fact that they belong to a European network of European history teachers, which at some level they can share their experiences, they can learn from each other, and basically the fear that a lot of them felt has been dissolved. There's still a very cautious approach to teaching history, but increasingly an emphasis on oral history, on evidence-based history, and the use of art and culture and theatre and drama to explore difficult, contentious issues. I think maybe that's enough for now. Thanks.
Maybe one additional question to you. Are there any law regulations, connected with history education in Ireland, similar to those which we heard about in Spain?
Sorry, could you repeat that question again?
If there are any regulation in law passed by the parliament connected with or regulating the education of history in Ireland.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the regulation of history really is done by government departments of education. And in a way, they have evolved over the years. So for example, when I was in school 10 million years ago, my Irish history went up to 1916. At that time, nobody wanted to touch the Civil War. So the Civil War was in Ireland for 10 months, and after independence was achieved, then we turned on each other. And that Civil War politics was too contentious to discuss. And it's only in recent years, and in the we had a decade of commemoration in the last year finished. And basically it was the first really decent discussion on the Civil War during that time. And that Civil War created the two major political parties in Ireland. And since 2020, elections will do anything. Both the Civil War parties are in coalition together along with the Green Party. So it was fated in Ireland as the end of Civil War politics. So we'll see.
Thank you. There is a chance for hope. Hope for hope. And now, Professor Kasianov.
Thank you.
We are coming to the other part of Europe. The question about history and history teaching in the country in which is the terrible war might be not easy, but I know that there are big problems. There were big problems in the history teaching and dialogue about history in the Ukraine itself and between Ukraine and some other countries. How do you see the situation now?
Well, generally, if we talk about challenges, we have to take into account the state of affairs. Ukraine is in the state of the war, and this is existential war because the neighbor which started this war, promotes the idea that Ukraine is a non-existent state. And this existential war for Ukraine, and unfortunately also existential war for Russia, because they posit the idea that Ukraine is a part of Russia, and Russia without Ukrainian territories also might be in danger. So the second, no less important thing is that the history is extremely securitized and weaponized in Russia and Ukraine, and not only in these two countries, but also throughout the world now. So it's a global tendency, and Ukraine, in this case, represents Russian-Ukrainian war, represents a kind of extreme case of weaponization and securitization of memory and history. As to teaching, I'd say it's quite contradictory, because Ukraine started educational reform in 2018, and it is the movement to 12 years secondary education, and then part of this reform is a reform of history education, and the major trend here is to make Ukrainian history a part of European history, which would be kind of natural procedure. So Ukrainian history now is being taught as what is called integral course. So, and we have extreme diversity of curriculum now. Let's say about 10 or 12 or even 15 variations of one single curriculum. And the same applies to textbooks. So we have numerous textbooks for the same grade. So this is the context, but the major part of this movement is the contradiction is that from one side we see development, more dramatic development of national narrative, representing Ukraine as a history of Ukrainians, ethnocentric narrative, with some extremes of presenting some organizations and movements as a single representatives of Ukrainian national movement. And at the same time, we see more inclusion here, because since 2016, for instance, Holocaust and Holocaust education getting more and more extensive part of Ukrainian history curriculum. And for instance, the history of Crimean Tatars since 2014 also taught in a more inclusive way, not like before 2014-15. History of Crimean Tatars presented as an integral part of Ukrainian history. So it's very complex and very complicated. And at the same time, definitely, you see that the major challenge is this existential war. And if somebody putting on historical arguments says that you do not have a history, and then promotes the idea based on this, that if you don't have a history, you do not have future, and you're non-existent as a nation. So then you have to respond. And then your response definitely would come into a kind of propaganda mode. So if we have, we have this mobilizational component in history teaching and in history research. I would say that the tendency is that the territory, the space for academic history writing, so-called analytical history, is shrinking. And the space and the territory of affirmative history and didactical history, those parts of history writing which works for counter-propaganda, for political means, etc., is extending. And so that's probably one of the challenges. So another thing in this case is that we have a certain kind of, as you asked before, but there's a certain kind of memory legislation. I think that Ukraine has probably is a champion of Europe in the number of memory laws. And some of these laws have a prescriptional power that turns the right to remember into duty to remember. So you have to remember certain things in a certain way, and if you do not do this, if you do not do this publicly, you might be considered as a persona non grata in this case. So it's also definitely connected to the work conditions. Generally, we have, in fact, we have a martial law in Ukraine. So, and this martial law, according to constitution, means the limitation of certain constitutional rights. However, the society is still diverse, and then this is another challenge in history education and in history writing. Because when you have a diverse society and you have to impose some kind of single version of the past, then you have discontent within society. And this is also a serious challenge. And in fact, there are different strategies how to deal with this. Ukraine is still diverse and still pluralistic society. However, the certain parts of memory legislation started to work in terms of criminalization of certain versions of history. And finally, the final point about this, about challenges, is about it might sound tragicomically or like kind of absurdity, that we have a trend to eliminate part of Soviet legacy, both in terms of decommunization or decolonization or whatever. And at the same time, these processes made in truly Soviet ways, from one point of view. At the second point of view, it is also paradoxical, because it's a great sense of paradox in this, because there is another party which wants to revise Soviet history, Soviet part of Ukraine history. And the name of this party is Putin, who definitely says that Ukraine was constructed under Soviet times, and the borders of 1991, which are proclaimed as a aim of this war, as a winning of this war. So the borders of 1991, it's a Soviet borders. And if you say this in Ukraine now, that it's Soviet borders, then you will be enemy of the people, of course. Because generally, Soviet legacy consider it as a part of Putin's ideology to destroy Ukraine. So, from one side, Putin wants to destroy Ukraine as a Soviet, with its Soviet borders, and from other side, people want to destroy Soviet legacy as something which brings Putin arguments to destroy Ukraine. So, historian in this case finds itself in himself or herself in a very unfavorable position. So you have to make a choice. What should you work for? And then the legislation, this legislation which now exists, at least two laws in Ukraine, now 3 laws in Ukraine, can be used against historians who would try to work as in the field of analytical history. Because in this case, you have to present different points of view, but if you present points of view which would not fit the official line, then you can be considered as some unwanted person. This is the challenge. These are the challenges. But of course, once again, I must go back to my initial point. All these challenges definitely provoked, majority of them provoked by external force, by the war, aggressive war, existential war, which Russia started against Ukraine, not in 22, much earlier.
Yeah, it's clear that the war as such and the situation in which the state of the Ukraine and Ukrainians are is also connected with some chances for the dialogue, for more openness, for being together, but also with the threats you described now. I will be coming back to you with another question. It will be the same question to all of you, and then I will have another different points to all of you. But the question is, if the problems you named are somehow to be solved internally in your countries, or do you think it would be useful to have support from international organizations, to have support on a different way for discussion, needed discussions in your countries? Let's start with Maria.
Well, regarding history, there is no competence in education in the European Union. So it's very difficult to find a common framework or even a common narrative as far as history teaching is concerned. But I think we have a common narrative because we all share history, we all have the same language regarding lack of democracy, lack of freedom, lack of justice, and suffering. And I think that it's something that is shared all over Europe, and we all had it in the past. So I think it's not so difficult to find this common narrative regarding history teaching. Obviously, there must be respect for every education system to see the way they want to teach it, and obviously it has to be respected. It couldn't be otherwise. But I think there are more things that unite us than separate us in terms of history teaching. And yes, I had to go back to what I said before, that there is still some reluctancy in terms of some content, which for some people should be out of the content taught in the education system, because they want to erase them. Okay, they just whenever we want to insist on that, and we try to find different methodologies to deal with them. They say that we are trying to use children's and young people's minds by manipulating them. So still there are this narrow way of understanding history and memory and remembrance. But I am very optimistic regarding that, because finally I think reason opens its way to the future, and young generations, when they travel and they are with people from other countries, they see that we are going through very similar procedures, very similar educational systems, and we have a general objective. We are members of a very old continent with a very old history that has separated us, but at the same time, it has brought us together, and we had to work internationally. I know that we need to solve our problems internally, but we have friends in Europe, and we have friends in international organizations as well. When I was giving the example of what is being done in some of the regional governments in my country, which is very impacting in society nowadays, you know, that after so many years waiting for a law to bring dignity to the victims, there are some people who just want to whiten a dictatorship and put it at the same level as democracy. I mean, that's an offense for people. But United Nations hasn't been quiet, and they have claimed that obviously the state, the Spanish government, has to do something in order to avoid and stop this attempt of new laws that are an attack to human rights and international law. So therefore, yes, there is an international community. There are organizations such as the Council of Europe, where I am very proud of being a member of the Assembly, because that's our work. We work every day trying to fight to defend human rights where they are not defended. And it brings hope to situations such as your country in Ukraine, because I think we have a responsibility. All other European countries have a responsibility, and we have to give a perfect, good, and very clear example of how things have to be done, and that memory cannot be forgotten, cannot be erased. Heritage, culture cannot be erased, because there will be a time that there will not be a war, and you will have something to hold tight, and it's your culture. So I think that yes, there must be a combination of internally solving problems, but at the same time we have a big, huge community that share values, and obviously that's what we are there for, to keep on defending them together.
Could I just say there that I find it hard to divide history from peace. And I think that there wouldn't be peace in Ireland if it weren't for external support that came at a particular time. And the European Union was particularly helpful during that time. It funded peace programs, which basically supported grassroots organizations, women's organizations, to develop capacity, to develop leadership skills, and to be, many of those now are part of the political process, either at local level or regional level or some at national level. So the ability to have outside support to have outside understanding, to have people on the outside with you at a particular contentious time, as Ireland had during that period, was very helpful during that time.
Thank you very much. And it is quite obvious that Ukraine needs some international help, but the question is if also by solving these problems with dialogue about history.
Sure. Well, first of all, you probably know that Ukraine became a member of Observatory for History Teaching in Europe, which is functioning under Council of Europe. So it's already some kind of sign of integration in this case and in cooperation with Europe. Generally, Ukraine cooperated with Europe, with Council of Europe since the end of 90s in history, curriculum reform, etc. Here I see a couple of, I'll say not challenges, but particular features of this. First of all, definitely the history teaching is a matter of national security and a matter of national sovereignty. So this is important that European structures, transnational structure, etc., would respect the right for sovereignty of Ukraine in history teaching. At the same time, Ukraine wants to be part of Europe, and being part of Europe or part of European Union means that you spare some of your national sovereignty, including this field. So this is, I don't know how to deal with this problem. It's very complicated, and what it requires is a permanent, continuous dialogue. And the second part of this is that it's Ukraine's role in promoting Ukraine in Europe, because, I think that Ukraine lacked the strategy in this case. We did in 21, we did a research on representation of Ukraine, the image of Ukraine in European history textbooks. So we observed textbooks from France, Germany, United Kingdom, and Poland. And what we have found that how Ukraine presented there, so it is Chernobyl, it is Holocaust, it is Holodomor, the Great Famine, and to a certain extent the revolution of 1720. So mostly catastrophes, mostly tragedies, etc. But Ukraine is not just about tragedies. Ukraine is about great culture, about, say, great cinema, Dovzhenko, and etc. So it is, I think it is a challenge to Ukraine itself to promote itself, having opportunity to cooperate with different European structures, to promote itself as a country with rich culture and rich history. Unfortunately, Ukraine lacked strategy in this case. But particularly now when Ukraine has these challenges like Russia war. But this is the agenda for Ukraine itself, not just for European structures or for European countries. And for this, we need a permanent and continuous dialogue. And for this, we need the support from Europe for this dialogue and for this permanent communication.
Thank you very much. And now, before I will pass the micro to the audience to give our participants to ask your question, I would like to ask Maria, you've been working for some time on the report for the Council of Europe on the theme, the role of sites of remembrance, places of commemoration and education for democratic citizenship. What is the aim behind this work? How is the work on this text processing?
Well, you know a little bit because you took part in an exchange of experts last March in Paris. I can't say that I'm very proud of this report, that I'm not the author. I inherited this from a previous member. But I think it's a very important report for countries such as Spain or Ukraine in the future. So many European countries that in a way or another has suffered from really traumatic history and shocking past. It's a way to give back identity and, as I said before, dignity to the people who have suffered in the past. And we want to do it through history teaching. So we have several objectives, but first of all, we want to highlight the sites of remembrance as very useful places and historical resources so that they can be used by teachers everywhere, and they can take students to these sites of remembrances such as museums. But we also want to have a look at other educational resources, not only museums. I think you mentioned before theater performances or cultural routes or even books, so that different resources can be used for the purposes of learning about remembrance, for young students to understand the past, to be able to find and create their own judgment by comparing different historical moments and different resources. And finally, the aim is to build a peaceful coexistence in a collective way. So that's one of the main objectives. And the last one, as everything we do in the Council of Europe, is to promote civic education, democratic values, and I think that the combination of working with the previous objectives makes it as a whole. And answering the second part of the question, how are we going on? We have been listening to different experts, and the criteria that we are using is bringing experts from countries such as Poland. We are bringing next week to Copenhagen people from the former Yugoslavia, because they also had a recent traumatic and painful history. And we will also provide some examples from my country in different levels. In some cases, there are directors, experts from museums. In other cases, as you are the director of this network. And we are also bringing representatives of government who are taking a very active role in implementing policies regarding remembrance and how they are applying them at the education system. This is the case of regional government in Navarra. So yes, it's a combination of expertise and at the same time with resources, so that we can try to finally make a product which is useful as recommendations for the different countries, members of the Council of Europe. And at the same time, we also have the objective that more and more countries join the Observatory of History Teaching, which is a resource that we have in the Council of Europe. And it has a very good panorama perspective of how history teachings should be taught. It has many resources, and it shares this narrative that we are talking about today. So basically that's the idea. And hopefully, if things go right, at the end of January, the report will be passed in Strasbourg, and hopefully everybody will follow it as a recommendation in the 46 countries members of the Council at the moment.
are the additional question to that, are there different political opinions involved in this discussion or not?
Well, as any political report, and this is very political, I'm sure there will be some differences because it is a very delicate issue, controversial. We know it. In every country there are some defenders and some opponents. But in the Parliamentary Assembly, we usually pass everything by majorities. So we always try to find a consensus in terms of the recommendations. We know that it will be difficult and there will be probably some people, depending on the recommendations we finally state. But I believe that there are more things that we share than differences. And as we are politicians and we know that things can be difficult, I know that finally we will do everything in our hands to be able to pass it. So far, there hasn't been so much tension, which I hoped will be the situation until the end. There will be very civilized debates and questions regarding debate. So. Yeah.
I'm sure that the list of these differences would be also very educational and very interesting for all of us. Barbara, the notion of freedom is of course crucial for every reconciliation processes. I would like to ask you if the history can be helpful in reconciliation processes or not.
History can be helpful to
yes, yes.
I think it can. I think what's important for reconciliation, and sometimes I don't use that word too much, because it has all kinds of connotations for different people. Really, I think what's important is creating the conditions that enable people who come from very different perspectives, that have maybe hurt each other, that have lost people, that they get an opportunity in a safe place to have conversations about difficult and contentious things. I think that reconciliation is not an end in itself, it's not an event, it's not a stop, it's not a full stop, it's something that is an ongoing process, that in a way there is no end to. And when we feel that things are all right now, something or some historical event or something is weaponized, either a memory, a site, a position, and then sometimes it's like going back to square one. So currently, I think the impact at the moment of political discourse and polarized rhetoric and personal insults between political parties, between society and politicians, is having a very undermining effect on democracy. And the organization that I worked for, along with the Hume Foundation, just recently have worked with local government and politicians to develop a set of ethical guidelines that politicians would sign up to, so that at some level there is a respectful discourse between particular political outcomes. So that wasn't an issue really up until the last few years, but the impact of personal insults, particularly on women politicians, and the impact of that on political life and on civic life on the whole will really undermine not just the reconciliation, but also the civility that holds society together. So reconciliation is an ongoing process, but also I think the current, I call it outrage politics that are going on at the moment, that we saw some tragic consequences of in Slovakia recently, and in lesser accounts of it in Ireland, where I come from, where people were attacked putting up posters, or normally where there would be a heated discussion, people suddenly, there were physical attacks on one another. So the question would be, when we talk about freedom, like, what is that? And maybe it's a bit like you said, maybe it's freedom that comes with responsibility. Because if there isn't responsibility, it will undermine democracy. And then if it undermines democracy, where are we going? And where is democracy in the European Union or anywhere? Anyway, that's probably a diversion, but however.
Thank you very much. It is exactly the case. Professor Kasianov, the question to you. How do you see how will impact the war with Russia, the historical education about the history of 20th century, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe, how it will affect also research into 20th century history and the narratives afterwards?
Thank you. Well, that's when you ask historian about, and you use the word will, so that's not the historian, okay, it's to somebody else. But well,
I'm sorry, I'm asking you to be a little bit out of the box.
I would probably would use the word would. Yeah. What? Yeah. So generally,
you are free.
I hope that it will be no end of history in physical terms, because because it's they're also one of the prospects, which is, by the way, actively discussed in certain circles. So generally, well, that's already becoming part of the history, and well, generally, definitely, it's already a huge negative effect of this war everywhere, not in Ukraine only, but everywhere, and probably it's a part of previous processes. Because I think that the Russian war against Ukraine is a part of global processes which started to develop prior to this war, and it's exactly about securitization and weaponization of the past. It's exactly about mixing history and memory, and replacing history with memory, and you know that all the war of the worlds always starts with the war of the words, and that's so it was articulated exactly by this Russian-Ukrainian case. But if you look at this globally, you will see, well, the recent story with Venezuela and Guyana, when there were historical arguments that the independent sovereign country was a part of another country. So quite remindful of something. Then we have the same story with Taiwan and China. Then we have the same story with North Korea and South Korea. And then if you look at Europe, you also would find something in 90s in Balkans, etc., etc. So generally, the Russian war against Ukraine is a part of more global shift in perception of the past and instrumentalization of the past. So it's already on, and I absolutely agree with the position that it's ongoing. Everything is ongoing process. It's started and it's going on. Unfortunately, it's escalating now, and then I think that this war would impact the process of further securitization and weaponization of history. It's already on the table. It's already, Russia mentioned past as a matter of national security in 3 basic documents, in the strategy of foreign policy, in constitution, and in, I don't remember what's the third document, but they're all strategic documents. Ukraine definitely now puts the memory and history issues into the agenda of national security. And the same case everywhere in hidden form, just going on throughout the globe. So, well, there should be strategies to prevent it. There should be strategies developed to do something to prevent this kind of instrumentalization. Of course, it might sound quite naive because it is instrumentalized by those who are in power. But, well, we have organizations like yours and other organizations of this kind, which could at least articulate it and at least put it on the agenda and to discuss it globally. And this is my proposal. I ask because
I see some hopes connected with these changes. For example, and also with some of our projects. For example, we have been making almost from the very beginning of our existence the project about 23rd August, about Hitler-Stalin Pact, about outcomes of that. And of course, this is connected with the information that the outbreak of the Second World War was, of course, connected with Nazi Germany, but was connected also with Soviet Russia. And even more, the first years of the Second World War, there was a cooperation between 2 totalitarianisms. Totalitarianism is not obvious narration in Europe. And I hope, for example, for changes in this kind of narration. Do you see a chance for that? Also in Western Europe?
Well, generally, I'd say it's a matter of, again, it's a matter of discursive strategy.
Yeah.
The conflict exacerbated exactly in, I think it was in the mid-2000s, when certain Baltic countries and Poland, of course, also, just started to revise the idea of Hitler's single responsibility for this. Well, there was a Ribbentrop-Molotov pact, so there were 2 sides there. And of course, Putin responded with accusations in Poland and the address of Poland, etc., etc. So that's just, again, this kind of manipulation of history and of weaponization of history. And, well, generally, I'm sure that as soon as someone, politicians at top level, start to speak about historical justice and restoration of historical truth, then you should expect that there will be problems there. And in this case, definitely we have this extreme case of this extreme example of Russia-Ukrainian war. And well, here the only solution to my mind is that once again, probably it sounds naive, but at least when you spoke about this huge research about different curriculums and you ask about the problems. So probably you should also have a list of these problems and the list of approaches to these problems, and then the variance of solutions and the variance of consensus, whatever. So I think that the only, and connecting to your question about the role of Europe or role of transnational organizations, it's exactly about this. It's exactly about permanent dialogue and permanent open dialogue between different parties, including those parties which you don't like, okay? And only in this case, you should be kind of, at least when you have a dialogue, you speak to each other. If you don't have a dialogue and you have a controversy and antagonism, then you just make this principle unsolvable.
So we have now quite nice consensus between you, Barbara, and Maria that this is the never-ending work, the dialogue about history. Ladies and gentlemen, we have quite unique opportunity having at this stage representatives of different types of activities connected with history. So we have politicians, we have, let's say, reconciliation activists, and we have an academic. Do you have any questions? Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't see you, but please. Please, yeah, okay, no, okay.
I don't know if the mic is on. Yeah, thank you. So the question is for Mr.
Please introduce yourself before.
Yeah. My name is Kristina Tamerlytė, and I represent the Lithuanian national broadcaster. I'm a journalist. This is the question for Mr. Kasianov. You said that recently in Ukraine there are some narratives of history that are not welcome. And you've given one example about the 1991 borders. Could you give us more examples of the narratives that are not wanted right now in terms, well, in Ukraine and because of the war that is happening? Thank you.
Generally, it's obvious that everything which connected to Russia, to Russian culture, etc., we're now in the process of de-Russification, and definitely some plots, some histories from Ukrainian history which contains Russian plots or Russian-related stories might be unwelcomed. That's for obvious reason. I do not accept it, but it is. And also there is kind of probably internal censorship when you have certain pages of Ukrainian history interpreted and imposed to society. For instance, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Yeah, that's presented in very single way, and so hiding some, let's say, black pages of this organization and presenting it in an extremely glorified manner, which produces not only conflicts within society. Now, there is no conflicts within society because society is mobilized against external aggressor, but it provides conflicts with neighbors, for instance, with Poland. And then, so we'll have a conference in a month, and then I will present the report about Polish-Ukrainian relations in the realm of memory, and then it's, sometimes it sounds so absurd that Ukraine in Poland have these issues. They should not have them, particularly now, but they're still there. So, and I think that there might be some stories might be unwelcomed from Ukrainian side, but some things might be unwelcomed from other sides. Sure.
Any other questions? So here, please.
Thank you. Simona Streltsova, Vilnagon Museum of Jewish History. While you're thinking about the history and the future, I think that we don't know about the future anything. On the other hand, we know a lot about our past, and it depends on what do we want to remember and how do we want to remember. It shapes our future. So my question probably to all speakers, let's say in 10 years or 5 years, what strategy would be that you could say we worked very well and we're happy with the results about the remembrance policy?
You mean remembrance policy in Europe?
In Europe, definitely, yeah. Thank you.
About remembrance, I think there needs to be, if this is the question you're asking, and I'm not sure if I've gotten it right, but that I think that in remembering, I think there has to be different mechanisms to help us remember. And I think arts, the culture, drama, are very helpful in actually creating interactive mechanisms of remembering. And I suppose what I notice is that museums are no longer just pieces of artifacts in glass cases, that at some level they are places of engagement where dialogue can happen amongst young people around. So if you were to look at two of the projects that the ENRS are doing at the moment, the Sound and the Silence and the In Between project, which brings people together from countries across Central Europe to engage with very difficult and contentious issues, and the impact that has, the positive impact that has on young people who are almost hungry for that kind of engagement that just isn't about reading in history books, but it's also engaging at a number of different levels.
Yeah. Well, I see that the future of museums regarding remembrance is absolutely related with education. And because I think that either the content of museums is passed on to future generations and they incorporate it, or probably the work hasn't been done correctly. So this reminds me to the Reykjavik summit that highlighted the importance of the connection between human rights, democracy, education, and culture at the same time. So I think that it is a task to put all intelligence working together, and that implies as well innovation and the capacity of the autonomy of the museums to be able to adapt to new necessities. So I think we are in a changing society, and everything has to be adapted to new necessities, also the work that museums do. But at the same time, I agree that unless we have a common narrative in terms of government supporting remembrance in the countries, the work that museums can do on their own can be limited if they don't get the support they really require and need. So altogether, I think that there must be a strategy, but working at different levels, and museums play a key role together with other resources, as my colleague mentioned, because remembrance is not something that is linked specifically and only to museums, but can be worked in different ways. So, and that's the way it should be done at the education system as well.
Yeah, definitely the role of museums has changed, and you see in this building how far we are, actually. Professor Kasianov?
Well, I'm not expert in these issues, but I think that in most general terms, I believe that the best strategy here is to recognize diversity and to recognize unity through diversity in any kind of venues, museums, other lieux de mémoire, like social networks, etc. So I think that, but probably the major challenge here also, it's about the externalization of memory. So probably in a year we should ask ChatGPT about these questions, and then we'd have a diverse responses.
As you know, ChatGPT is using our answers on the creative way. Another question? Yes. Yeah? Joseph Hüchtel, Austria.
Thanks. Joseph Hüchtel, President of the Austrian Society for Bettering International Relations and former Member of Parliament. When I look back in the history, at least in the last centuries, it was a tendency to get more democratic societies in the world. I think we can agree on that. Nowadays, in the last 20 years, when there was a lot of studies, especially from British groups, concerning the development of democracy in the world, we see some contrary development. Nowadays, we do have only 24 countries in the world which can be considered as totally democratic. This means only 8% of the living worldwide population. My question is now, do you think that the worldwide controversy between democracy and authoritarian regimes?
I think the historian should start.
It should be.
It's a very interesting challenge for you to answer this question.
It should be philosopher rather than historian. We do not have philosopher here. So historically, democracy is a very young phenomena. Yeah. So, and while totalitarianism, not totalitarianism, but authoritarianism has a much longer history. So. I think that we're still in the process. However, I don't think that quantity here overcomes the quality. So I think that still democratic regimes are still more, at least more flexible and adjustable to changing circumstances. So I would not be. Well, honestly speaking, I would be pessimist as a historian. As a private person, I would be more optimistic. We all know what happened in the past. At least we believe that we know what happened in the past, and we definitely do not know what would happen in the future. And this is the basis for optimism. So, but your question is really important in terms of current situation, because really we are probably not at the edge, but we're approaching the edge of controversy between democracy and autocracy or autocratic or the totalitarian regimes. Even we see the kind of revision of the concept of democracy, like it was in Russia in the 2000s when they promoted the idea of sovereign democracy, or like in Hungary promoted the idea of, what was that, illiberal democracy? I don't remember. Yeah, so.
Deliberative?
Illiberate something, I don't know. So I'm not political scientist, but anyway, we see kind of hybrid forms of combination of democratic procedures. Finally, look, Hitler came to power using democratic procedures. So it's continuous process of interaction between different forms of organization of society. And the only thing I can say as a historian is that if you look through, at least through 20th century, you would see that democratic regimes always won in these conflicts. I don't know what would happen next, but at least history gives some grounds for what can be called optimism. Thank you.
Do you like to add something? Yeah.
No, but
yeah, feel free.
I think that there's an assumption that democracies will muddle through and last, and that they will continue to exist. And I think it's part of education, really, in somewhere to do more work around active citizenship, around voting, around different types of democracy. And I think that we've become lazy around it and make assumptions that it'll just go on, and I just don't think that we can do that.
It was too comfortable.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also agree with you, because if we think about our past, history is like a cycle. It goes on and it's always repeated. So I suppose that we may begin in the end of a cycle, and there is a new cycle coming in, and we need to be ready for that. I don't think that should mean the end of democracy. I think that our democratical systems are really strong, but obviously democracy is weak at the same time, and it depends on all of us to strengthening it. The values that unite freedom and our countries, or the countries that still defend a very strong democracy, should keep on fighting within our own people to keep on defending it. And at the same time, not everybody shares the same concept of democracy. Probably if we ask each other, what do we understand by democracy? We will give, I don't know how many people we are here, but probably there will be more than 100 different questions regarding democracy. Because we had different education. And depending on the education we were given, depending on how our parents taught our values, and depending on the way we lived in our country and the freedom we had in our country, we may have a different concept of democracy. So therefore, what I think is that we really need to find what is shared, the really strong links that we share in Europe defending democracy, and stick to it really closely, really tight, because that's what unites us. And that's probably the root for the future of democracy in our continent, that we need to keep on defending. But once again, if we don't work properly in the education system with young people, especially nowadays, with such wild social networks, with such violent content, with so many aggressive messages which even attack the principles of democracy, our society, our common values are in danger. And that's why I insist in my country about the importance of education, but not only content, the principles of democracy. Because otherwise, what we understand for democracy in our continent will be in risk in the future.
Thank you very much. It was perfect end of our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, now the surprise. But before the surprise, I would like to thank Maria, Barbara, and Georgiy for the discussion, for coming to us, and for sharing with us your opinions. Thank you very much for that.